When you talk about cell-to-cell communication and you talk about signaling molecules, it's important to talk about receptors because in order for a signaling molecule to have an effect on a target cell, there has to be something for that target or for that signaling molecule to bind to, right? So there has to be a receptor, and receptors can either be intracellular, right? Or they can be on the cell membrane, right? And so your intracellular receptors, those are ones that are inside of the cell. Now, inside of the cell, right, can mean either inside of the cytoplasm, right? Or they can even be inside of the nucleus in the nucleoplasm, okay? And these often act as transcription factors, which end up upregulating the rate of transcription. So we'll just put upregulate transcription. Now, on the cell membrane, you can have receptors that act as ligand gated channels or ligand, depending on which syllable you want to put the emphasis, right? But your ligand gated channels. And remember the way that these work, think back when we talked about membrane dynamics, right? You have the cell membrane and you can have a channel across that membrane that can then have a sort of gate that blocks it. When the ligand binds to that receptor, it can cause a conformational change in that protein, which will cause it to move and that gate to move. So it can open that sort of channel, right? And these can be ion channels, or they can be the channel for something else. But what happens is there is a conformational change in the membrane protein. Okay. The receptors themselves can act as enzymes. Okay, remember, enzymes help speed up the rates of chemical reactions. And so these can be like guanylate cyclase, which helps produce cyclic GMP. It can be tyrosine kinase, or there can be something called a serine threonine kinase. And we'll see these enzyme receptors more a bit later on, but you may have heard of some of these, like your tyrosine kinase receptor is part of a specific signaling cascade known as the MAPK pathway, or what's called the MAPK pathway, right? And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later on because that's kind of involved in cancer. And the last type of receptor that we're going to sort of mention is something known as a G protein receptor, right? And these G proteins act as second messengers. And you may have talked about second messengers before, but your second messengers are sort of involved in signaling cascades, right, which amplify signals. And so you may have heard of some of these before, and we'll talk about them in more detail in different videos, right? But like your cyclic AMP pathway or the phospholipase C pathway, or some people refer to that as the IP3 or PIP2 pathway. Okay, and we'll look at these different signal transduction pathways in a little bit more detail in their own separate videos, right? But right now, it's important to recognize that the receptors can vary. And one of the things that's very, very important to remember is that it is the ligand receptor interaction that dictates the response. Okay, so even though we have all of these different sort of receptor types, it's the ligand receptor interaction. So ligand receptor interaction that dictates the response. Okay? And what that means is that a signaling molecule itself is not responsible for the response on a target cell. The epinephrine binding to a receptor, or adrenaline binding to a receptor, can have a different effect depending on what type of receptor it binds to. Okay, and so it's the combination between the signaling molecule, the ligand, and the receptor that is going to generate the response. Okay, so you always have to think about those two entities together as a couple, right? Your ligand and your receptor dictate the response, not just the signaling molecule itself.